Good afternoon, everyone. I kindly ask you to put on your headsets, otherwise this is going to be very quiet for you. I don't see many people wearing them yet, so we'll wait another minute so we can officially start this session. Okay, I think some people are wearing them now. They should be on your chair, so all of you should have one. All right. A warm welcome from my side, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a great time at ChangeNOW already. All right. So we'll have a session on rethinking economics, putting justice and equality first today. For decades, economic growth, measured almost exclusively through GDP, has been the primary indicator for success for countries, for communities, for companies. But what if that measure is not incomplete, but deeply flawed? What if, in chasing endless growth, we are undermining the very foundations of our well-being, our ecosystems, and our economies? My name is Zarah Steinbrenner. I'm your moderator of this session, and I'm inviting you to rethink the logic of economic systems with us. I ask you to question not just how much we grow, but what we grow, and who benefits and at what costs. This session kicks off with a keynote that critiques the status quo and sets the tone for rethinking existing systems. From there, we'll explore concrete entry points into transformation, from finance and policy to community action and imagination. And finally, we'll hear from one of the most compelling youth voices on the planet, sharing her knowledge from indigenous traditions and movements in the Global South. Together, we'll ask this question: what does a just and regenerative economy really look like, and how do we begin to build it? Having said that, I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker. He's the Executive Director of the Hot or Cool Institute. A warm welcome to Akenji. I can see he's just being mic'd up, but he's on his way.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of technology these days. I'm not sure I'm very comfortable with it. If you can hear me, put up your thumb, like that thumbs up. Perfect, perfect. It's good to see you all. And welcome to Paris. It's a spring in Paris, the perfect place. And I'm going to talk to you about a revolution. Don't worry, it's not the French Revolution. It's a different kind of revolution, because we all know that a revolution is coming. That's why you're here. It's a question of whether it's a planned revolution or it's a chaotic one that is going to cause a lot of pain and havoc. So my first question for you to hold in mind is, when you think about the future, how is it you think about it, if you think about it at all? Is it just a little tweak in the technology and the way we live today, or it's a radically transformed future that is quite different from what we have today? That is what we are going to explore over the next 18 minutes. And the work I'll be showing you is, as you all know, we're in 2050. It's spring 2050. That's why it feels a lot more comfortable than it was in 2025. And one way of understanding this is to go with the press. What is the press saying this spring 2050? And don't worry, the press has become a lot more honest now and reflective of what society is. I'm not showing you Fox News, right? So the first thing you would see is that one of the islands that got submerged under the sea because of sea level rise has actually been welcomed by Holland, and they've given it its own autonomous region where the people can live. So it's not just individual climate migration as we thought of in 2025, it's an entire island that has moved, right? The experiment China was playing around with, sponge cities that are much more resilient, opening room in cities for water to flow, removing all the concrete, and all the asphalt and pavement, has really been very successful, much more than people realize. And as such, Chinese cities are so much more resilient that lots of Europeans and Americans are beginning to copy it, right? And for those of you that came from Amsterdam, I'm sure you saw the exhibition of what the wild 20s and the 30s looked like before we got to where we are in 2050. And in fact, if you've not seen it, after this, just go downstairs. There's a similar exhibition of what ideas for 2050 did look like. And as Costa Rica is showing us very clearly, citizen assemblies actually work. We know that they work because the Citizen Assembly of Costa Rica recently vetoed the budget of its government because it did not reflect their well-being objectives. So society has actually changed. Now, let me take you a bit closer to my city. The map looks like a typical map you would have seen in 2025, except instead of seeing its economic productivity, we're measuring something else in my city. We're measuring whether the investments by the municipality are causing social tension or are increasing our well-being. So we have a new set of measures now that is quite different, but it's also a bit, there's a lot of rewilding and reclaimed spacing that has happened, and so nature has been welcomed back into the city. We live in closer communities now, urban villages, and there's a lot of sharing. Of course, there's car-free transportation, unlike in 2025 when we had to pay really a high amount to get to the ChangeNOW conference. And if you look very carefully, you will see where we have our citizen assembly hall and our tools library. So you don't have to each house buy a whole set of tools for itself. So it's quite different. But why did this change so much from what we knew in the 2020s and the 2010, right? That is what I'm going to walk you through. And essentially, there was one fundamental thing we needed to do to move away from the C4 solutions, corporate capture of climate change solutions. That is because, as this diagram would tell you, in the 20s, the Hot or Cool Institute did an analysis of people's consumption and lifestyles to understand what the impacts were on climate change and how climate change was affecting people. And what it showed very clearly is that when you look at food, mobility, housing, consumer goods, leisure, and services, we were living way above our carbon budget, and we needed to reduce by significant amounts. And in fact, the magnitude of reductions was so high and the urgency was so much that we needed nothing more than a radical transformation, not only in terms of carbon, but also in terms of inequality. Because as you would see from this analysis, on the one side, it's a bunch of countries that sat enjoying all the luxuries like we did enjoy in Paris at the time. And on the other side was a bunch of supplying countries that sent stuff over to us so that we can sit and consume. That had to change if we had to get a tenable world and a tenable future. And in fact, as we got to discover very clearly, it was the top 10% of consumers around the world that were causing this climate change problem. And so, of course, there were lots of protests, and the youth just refused to allow their future to be sacrificed. And so, here we are in Paris. We know a little bit about revolutions in France, and we've seen it in history. And we know that the conditions were already set for another revolution. We had to act, or we'll have our hand forced. One thing that became very clear is that we cannot deal with climate change, or we could not deal with climate change just as a technical problem where we throw technical solutions at it. The climate problem was a social problem. It was a problem of inequality, social tensions. The urgency of it also did not allow that we individualize the solutions, but that we deal with it collectively. And that while we were negotiating in the IPCC in terms of national governments, the economic patterns transcended, the economic patterns, environmental consequences, and attitudes transcended national borders. So we needed to widen the scope of responsibility for solutions. And we could not keep pretending about our consumption. We had to address it as part of the problem at the time. So what did we do? We had to break up with our false friends. A few of you are going to get upset now because your grandparents worked for those false friends. But bear with me, just stay there. What is a false friend? It's part of what I call the C4 solutions. If you're creating a so-called solution that cannot be scaled and is just catering to a few people, you're creating niches and you're working for the privileged. If your solution is based on continuing consumerism, you're just feeding into the same system that was creating chaos in the 2030s, in the 2020s. If it did not recognize the urgency of the problem, or if it was delaying meaningful action, then it was a false solution. I'm going to go through a few of these. Those of you that are mad, stay put there. You would see how we overcame this. The first one is our dear friend, the eco-label. just one way of prolonging the issue of consumerism and slapping a sticker on it. If we really did care about unhealthy products and consumptions, we would have kept them outside of the market completely instead of having them in and slapping a sticker on them. The second one is what I call the new Trojan horse, the electric car. We had problems with cars. It wasn't whether it was just electric or fossil fuel. There were problems with cars. We had to change the architecture completely. There was also this wonderful thing where we continued doing exactly the same things. Our companies did exactly the same things they were doing, and then they paid other people far away to compensate them to stay poor, instead of also changing their society. The next one is the very well intended approach to getting our corporations to account for the impact on society, both positive and negative, but allowing so many loopholes that it just became a license to greenwash. And last but not the least, which is probably one of the more painful ones, our governments used to sit at a place called the COP and have negotiations. First, they said it was going to be limited to 1 degree, and then 1.5 degree, and then at some point they started talking about 1.7 degrees, and everyone got mad and said, well, how far are you going to push this? And just as evidence of this, from the first time they released the first climate report to about 40, 50 years later, the problem was getting worse and worse in a much faster way. So this is why we had to break up with our false friends, because as this will show you very, very clearly, we did in fact make improvements in the 2030s, 2020s, and 30s. The energy intensity of our technologies and our products had fallen, which was a really good thing. How much resource we were putting in there had fallen, which was also a very good thing. But our populations were growing, so more people had to consume more of the efficient stuff. And each one of us was consuming a lot more than we did before when things were less efficient. So we were confusing efficiency for sustainability, which is a typical mistake that some people still make these days. And we had to move away from that because the consequence was that we needed overall even more consumption. We were doing even more consumption, and it was creating what is called a rebound effect. And as a consequence, hey, what's up? Everything is up. You know, pollution was increasing, social tension was increasing, the impact of fertilization were getting even worse. And because of that, we needed to move away from most of these approaches and break away from these false friends. What do we have now? In the 2030s, we decided to call it a decade of transformation from private sufficiency to public luxury, from private wealth to private sufficiency and public luxury. What essentially does that mean? I've shown you the example of the cars, right? We knew at the time that we had a car culture. Just look at this analysis that are done by the Hopkins Institute. Cars are predominantly the highest impact areas of our mobility and flying. You can see in the case of Canada, which essentially has a car culture, or in the case of India, that has a motorcycle culture. And our solution to this was to keep producing more cars, but to electrify them. It did not solve the problem because it needed more resources, it had the same labor conditions or even worse, and we're having bigger cars. Even though they were more efficient, so many more people were driving. So the same traffic congestion, the same need for more resources and energy was the problem. And not only that, it was causing global havoc because we were transferring the burden to other parts of the world instead of solving the problem, what I call burden shifting, right? So we needed to move from this individualized idea of car ownership to create public luxury. I've just given this as an example of what happened. Some governments decided in the 2010s, like London, that we're going to set public expectations that you should stop investing in your own private cars. We're going to review speed limits, especially around school systems, cultural centers, to make sure that people get used to the idea of slow driving. We're going to review public transportation routes, introduce new micro-mobility options, and make it a lot more luxurious for people. It's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more effective, it's going to be cleaner, and it's going to be more aware of the fact of why women were not using public transportation. And once we had a few experiments like this, we decided to scale. I'm just going to show you some of those examples of what happened around those periods, right? London started introducing the congestion charge. Heathrow had a lot of protests when they said they could not build new airports. So what did they do? They capped passenger numbers. And by the way, these are newspapers from the 2010s and 20s and the 30s. These are not from 2050, right? Berlin set up bike lanes as temporary ones, but citizens loved them so much that they stayed. Milan turned public spaces that were typically for cars into parking lots and green spaces where people could come and have fun. And of course, Paris, having experienced what walkable cities were, voted that even more streets should become pedestrian friendly, right? The 2040s, we took another approach, the approach of universality. So looking at our fundamental rights and needs as human beings and say, we can still have businesses, but not everything is for profit. How do we change the system? And this is why most of you would remember the COVID pandemic in the 2020s. If you don't remember, your grandparents certainly remember, and they learned a lot of lessons from there, which is why we've reflected them now. But what I want to show you is what billionaire wealth looked like and how it grew during that period. This is done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, so they know what they're talking about. But focus on the period during the COVID pandemic from 2020 April to 2020 July. In 3 months, the wealth of billionaires grew by 27% to $10.2 trillion. Within 3 months, while people were locked and couldn't go beyond their balconies, people were dying. There was inability for some people to even access basic services. There was a lot of wealth accumulation. And where were we making wealth? Off the health of people and off of technology. While Rome burned, things were going upside down. So you can understand why there needed to be some kind of a change. So we agreed in the decade of the 2030s that we're going to set a social floor. We're not only going to look at reducing emissions, we're going to set a social floor below which people should not fall, so that everyone can have a life of dignity. The question essentially became around then, if you have a fast shrinking carbon budget and the power disparities among countries, among different genders, across different parts of society were so heavy that the competition over the shrinking carbon budget is, how do you distribute it in a way that is fair, that is just, and that is equitable? One of the things we chose to do in terms of consumption was to revisit the choice architecture, especially as it comes to food, mobility, transportation, consumer goods, leisure, and services. The first thing was not just putting eco-labels, but to edit out the harmful consumption options. So essentially we asked, what are the areas that have privatized profits but distributed burden? So private yachts, tourism to space, and all those things got edited out. But we also asked the question, what are the incentives for consumerism? Your frequent flyer miles that took you to Paris at a time, or your consumer loyalty programs, we had to edit those out. But also things like speculative financial investments in fundamental needs became out, no longer an option. But not only that, we had to edit in other aspects, because you don't just take out things. Social innovation, alternative diets, luxurious public transportation, and as well as editing out and editing in, we needed to make sure that there was a level equitable access in society. This is why we capped wealth limits. We capped intergenerational transfer of wealth. We made sure that certain segments of the population did not own more than a certain percentage of national income, just to make sure that there was some kind of equity. But something else started happening going beyond that. When I talk about universality, so you've heard about universal basic services, dividends, universal public services. All of this, whether or not you like them, are trying to apply one thing, the universal principle, the universality principle. Is the reason why we talk about universal human rights, because we all have the same rights. But we had experiments after the Second World War during this period, during which we asked the question, how do we set up healthcare systems in a way that almost everyone has good access to healthcare, and it doesn't depend on how rich you are. So we had universal healthcare in the countries that had learned their lessons, like the UK or most European countries. Unfortunately, not for some parts of North America, but you had universal healthcare. So we thought, why don't we use that lesson and apply it to other areas where we think are quite fundamental? So the area of housing, everyone needs housing, for example. So you can no longer do speculative financial investment in housing. It doesn't mean you can't buy a house. You can buy a house, but you cannot hedge on it just so you can make a profit off of someone else, right? Public transportation, we have non-profit businesses and non-profit provisioning of public transportation, because it's so fundamental to everyone to go meet their grandpa, their friends, their boyfriends and spouses and all whatnot. And for food, we decided to decommodify food and a lot of definancialization in certain areas, because when you have a crunch, actually making profits off of food goes beyond just being an incentive for producing more food. It just becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of profit generation. Right? So the last thing we did in the 2050s, which we're still now playing with, so welcome back to the 2050s, is moving towards the area of global commons. So let's revisit what the newspapers are saying. You remember when our grandparents used to sit in the COP or the climate change meetings and kept postponing the goals? We've learned from that. We no longer just have the United Nations Environment Programme or the IPCC or the UNFCCC. We have a UN Council on Ecological Stability. It learns from all of those, it pulls them together, but it also does something a little bit more. It looks at the powers that the UN Security Council had, and it's mandated the Ecological Stability Council with a lot of this power so that it has authority at beyond national borders. We've also created resource trusts, because there was a lot of discussion around the time about critical minerals and mining and problems associated with it, and what to do with countries that were endowed with these resources, and there was a geopolitical competition on who can sort of can get rights to exploit these resources and who could not. So we've created a global trust that is looking at distribution on a much more equitable basis and other forms of compensation that are actually also making sure that the needs of these countries that are endowed are met without just having very extractive approaches, right? We've also restructured our corporations quite fundamentally. We now have globally extended producer responsibilities. We have different types of corporations, worker-owned corporations. So businesses still exist, as most people assume that the point was that businesses should not exist, but it's a different form of accountability now, and businesses that cater for fundamental needs are quite different from businesses that are catering essentially just for profit generation. And one of the most important things, we decided that the governance architecture that we created in the 1910s, 20s, and the 30s, when we did not have the type of technology that we have now, when the environment was not so much of an issue, when inequality was not so prevalent in society, it was no longer fit for purpose. And so we had to get a new social contract that reflected a new set of rights, that applied a universality approach, that understood how to apply technology in a much more diligent manner, and that essentially revisited what it means to govern and to be governed, and how citizens can participate in this in a way that they actually feel effectively represented. So, given that you were at this conference, ChangeNOW, in the 2020s or in 2025, the question became, what did you do after that to move us towards that 2050 goal or that 2050 world that we had created? Essentially, in going to that conference, there had been a lot of discussion. Is it individual responsibility? Is it an individual company? Is it just a single household? Is it an individual consumer? Is it your responsibility, or it's system change? But what we learned very quickly is that you cannot afford to be an individual. You cannot afford to be an individual company. You cannot afford to be an individual consumer or citizen. We need to work together, and we need to work collectively. Individual change or system change, this is a false dichotomy that we could not afford. And even more, we had to revisit the systems, not just from a position of how they're serving political institutions and aspirations, but how fundamentally they're meeting the needs of everyone, not just a few, and in a way that well-being was optimized across the board. So the question, which I asked at the beginning of this last section, what did you do? You're all sitting here because you know change is going to happen. Again, is it planned or chaotic change? How much pain do we want in that change? Because whether or not you accept it, we are in a competition to shape the future, each and every one of us. We're in a competition to shape the future. Now, who are we competing with? We're competing with people who think we would keep exploiting and feeding the world with fossil fuels. We're competing with a few people that think they can sit over the majority and make decisions over what they should do. We're competing with segments or sectors of society that think they're parts of the world that are just there to dig and cater for their needs and they stay wealthy. We're competing with technology that doesn't care about people, except it just wants to use people to make even more money. And the most important one, we're at a very dangerous precipice where what we consider law for humanity is being exercised in very unfortunate ways. The question then is, what did you do after ChangeNOW 2025? Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. I believe that gave us a great foundation to follow up our next conversations. We'll explore now how new economic models are already being implemented and what it takes to make post-growth real at scale. So let's welcome our panelists who bring practical experience to the table. I kindly ask Rob Hopkins, founder of the Transition Network, author and speaker, and known for reframing climate solutions through the lens of imagination and collective action on stage. Welcome, Rob. Followed by Hans Stegeman, Chief Economist at Triodos Bank, thought leader on sustainable finance and post-growth economics, an advocate for aligning capital with long-term ecological and social well-being. Perfect. I would like to start with a brief reflection on Luis's keynote. So we've just heard a very powerful critique of our current economic systems. What does it look like when you try to build something different in real life, having to deal with the boundaries of our current systems?
I will start. It's always strange to look at people and know that they hear you in the ear. But I think what Luis did was a very powerful imagination of how a future can be done, how it can be realized. And I think it's very important for all of us to realize that it is possible. We have the technologies, we have the possibilities to create a bright and beautiful future with all the principles of post-growth and degrowth behind it. I recognize a lot of it. But there are also two other things that needs to be done to realize that future. The one is still every day criticizing what is wrong in our current society. And I think especially for people here looking outside, so we are here in a very big bubble, but outside it is different. So we need to speak up always, every day again, about what is wrong. And the third one is, and I think that's what we're here and that's the panel about, trying to show that different choices can be made in the here and now. That we can create differences that inspire that future, that inspire the vision that we have in the here and now with the entrepreneurs that are busy with it. And if we forget one of those three things, so having a vision, always criticizing what is wrong, but also experimenting in the here and now how it can be better, if we forget one of those three, it goes wrong. So every day we must do all the three of those.
Do you want to follow up on that, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, lovely to meet you all. Thank you for coming. I feel like I'm kind of in the opposite of a silent disco. It's like the music's out there, and it's a kind of a strange thing. Yeah, what was brilliant, I think, and we'll come on to talk more about it. But what Luis did so powerfully, I think, is to give us an experience after which we can say, when I was in the future. For me, I feel like in the activism that I do, the main thing I'm trying to do is to get people to have an experience where afterwards they say, when I was in the future. I saw a T-shirt in 2020 a young woman was wearing at one of the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington. It said, "I've been to the future, we won." And it gave me goosebumps and has really redefined the work that I do since, in that actually it's not okay anymore just to talk about the problems and just to talk about what's wrong, but we need to be bringing alive in people, not just giving people things to run screaming in the opposite direction from, but give people things to run towards in a way that is multi-sensory, that kind of gets into your bones. And I feel like Luis said a very good example of that. In answer to your question, certainly in the transition movement, which has started about 18 years ago, is active now in 50 countries, is a community-led, bottom-up response to the climate emergency. What can we do in the place we are, with the resources we have, with the people that we have? Our experience of that is that it's not easy, But if you can find a way to mobilize people and the stories, actually now you can look across that movement and see incredible examples of communities building new economies, putting new things in place. I think the thing that we have to bear in mind, absolutely, there is a huge pushback, rollback. You know, I've been to a few sessions today where companies have talked about keeping to their Paris commitments of 1.5 degrees. We have breached 1.5 degrees the last 2 years. We are losing this in terms of climate. But there was a study that came out last week that said that globally 89% of people still believe that actually we need urgent action on climate. But when you ask them, how many people do you think in the world think we need urgent action on climate? They say, well, it's probably about 40%. We have been tricked into imagining that this is a minority position when it is absolutely not. And what we try and do in the transition movement is start where we are. And I'm sure we'll come on and I can tell some stories of what that actually looks like.
Yeah, I would like to touch upon that. You already mentioned the word imagination now. When we talked before this panel, you said that imagination is often a political act. Why is that, and how does it shape how we think about our economy?
So I think we are in a really dangerous time now where our imagination, our sense of the future is being colonized. In the same way that the past was colonized, our futures are being colonized. And there was a brilliant article that Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor wrote, which some of you might have seen last week, which had a quote I just want to read. She said, "Contemporary far-right movements lack any credible vision for a hopeful future. The average voter is often only remixes of a bygone past alongside the sadistic pleasures of dominance over an ever-expanding assemblage of dehumanized others." And the great bell hooks once said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. I found about 5 years ago, I was reading things by Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, people who are really brilliant thinkers on the climate emergency, and they kept saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. And these words sort of got under my skin and set me off on this inquiry of saying, why are we having a failure of the imagination at the very time when physics demands that we reimagine everything? And I think that there is a kind of a perfect storm of factors that are causing our collective imaginations to contract, and that's profoundly dangerous. And so for me, those words that we hear often of like, well, we've always done it like that, are just the death of the imagination. And so what I try and do with community groups, with municipalities, with businesses, is to work with them to say we need to expand way, way, way beyond that kind of thinking. You know, the time for moving in little incremental steps is really, really behind us, and we need the people who can move really fast with great imagination. Any strategy proposed now for tackling climate change that doesn't seem at least a little bit ridiculous is not ambitious enough. I spend a lot of time saying to groups and people, be more ridiculous, embrace the ridiculous, because that's really the scale of what we need to do. So yeah, I'm a great advocate of the imagination, and also that we need to be helping people to fall in love with the future. If we don't talk about the future in a way that it gets inside us, the poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. What does our activism look like if that's what it's about? What does our activism look like if its primary goal is not to block things, is not to give people enough information, but is to cultivate longing for a different future, for the kind of future that Lewis painted there? That story, what are the stories that go along with that? What are the stories of the people in 2025 who started something that led to that world? What does that world smell like? What does it taste like? How do we make tears in time and pull it through into the present to give people an experience of it?
Thank you. I think touching upon that, Hans, I would like to hear more of your practical experiences what you do at Triodos, and what are steps you take towards like a post-growth economy, and does imagination play a role there?
Maybe first a small bridge to the story of imagination. I think it's important, especially in finance and economics, to remember that's only a narrative. It's only a story, an imagination that we have, that we think is a reality and that restricts us from doing different stuff. I think In finance, or in the financial system, it's very important to understand that it is just only fictitious rules made up, and the basics is trust. Trust in money, trust in the system, nothing else than that. So you can do, so that's a great idea, because you can change whatever you want. You can make from it whatever you want. And if you start from that assumption that it is just a narrative that you can change, Triodos Bank was founded 45 years with the idea to change finance and finance change from within the system. So try to finance those entrepreneurs, those change makers that would create a different structure, the different system, but also from within the system trying to change the system. And if I look back for those 45 years, one thing is sure, we are not there yet. We have still a long way to go. But what we also can see is that in those 45 years, sustainable finance is a huge field, which you can, as Lewis said, a part of it is definitely greenwashing. A part of it definitely does not help to bring anything more closer in the sustainable world. So that's part of it is not useful. And what our role is, and that's what we did last year, say, okay, we are probably the first post-growth bank. And not that we exactly know what it is, but a few things is what we know. And also in the story of Lewis, what's very clear in the post-growth and degrowth narrative is that we have to phase out a part of the economy, the harmful part. So what we do as a bank, we don't finance fossil fuels. We stopped, I think, 4 years ago with fast fashion in our portfolios. Our first thing we do when we do finance, or bank finance or investment, is to understand what money does in the real economy, trying to understand what it does in the real economy, which is very important to do that because there are two things on it. A lot of money is doing nothing in the real economy. A lot of money is only making more money. And another part is only doing harmful stuff in the real economy. And we tried to step that up last few years to say, okay, but to understand that it is sustainable is not good enough. We need to understand what money does for a transition. So what is the transformative potential of every investment and financing activity we have? Is that easy? No. Do I understand it completely? No. Do my colleagues understand completely what a concept is? No. Does that matter? No. Because I think that's where we are. If we are at a place where we don't have the data, we don't have the numbers, but we have our own conscious mind and an understanding of where we want to go to, then we're in the right place. Is that uncomfortable for people in finance? Yes, it definitely is. That's the kind of conversation I always have with my colleagues. But that's what Triodos Bank tries to do. We try to be at the forefront as an entrepreneur, trying to change the system. And every day I think, yeah, this is not going fast enough. And for me, that's the link with post-growth. So trying to scale up those activities that you need in that society that Lewis showed in 2050, trying to scale down the rest, trying to address the logic of finance, which is currently not working in favor of change, the logic of economics, which is only incremental, superficial change and not really helping in any sense. And addressing that time and time again, because also we as a bank, as being part of the financial system, are bounded by that system and by that imaginary reality that we also have to adhere to. That's what we call compliance, risk, etc. And addressing that every time and time again is the only way to change a little bit the system. Is that going fast enough? No, definitely not, because we're still a small bank. But that's what we need to do.
Just a follow-up question on that. So what do you believe, what does it need or what does it take for our financial system to support these imaginative community-rooted solutions?
I'm sorry, people, now it's getting more into the details of the financial system. I think there are three levels. I talked a little bit on one level, what we can do as a financial institution, the ethical, values-based decision that we can take. Another part is the system itself. And if we start with the biggest part of money, is money creation. Money creation is done by private banks, in the Western world at least. And money is created if a bank hands out a loan. When does a bank hand out a loan? If you can make a nice return out of it. So the incentive of the system, the primary incentive of the financial system, is a high return. So what does it mean in the story about, Lewis did not mention the word degrowth or postgrowth, but what it means that we have a growth imperative in the financial system. It can only exist if there is profit that is made and a return that is high enough for a bank to be profitable. So what needs to happen is that we really think about money creation. Then we have to think about the ownership structure of the financial sector, because if the owners, the shareholders of a bank, only want to finance a bank if it makes a return of 8 to 12%, and we call that financial stability, the profit incentive in the financial system is very high. We see it in banks. We see it, of course, in the asset management industry. We see a lot of intermediation in the asset manager industry. So we have asset owners, pension funds that have an asset manager, a very big asset manager like BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street. They do their job very passively, don't know where they invest in, nobody cares because it's only about returns. Then we end up with a problem. So that also needs, these are the big changes that need to happen in the system itself. Then we come to the values of bankers, because every banker can, within the system, do what we do as Triodos Bank. So try to understand what their choice as a banker is doing in the real economy. Yeah, of course you can do it. You have the freedom to do it. So that can be changed. And the third layer is, of course, and that's the problem that Triodos Bank had for a long time, there are not enough sustainable activities in the real economy. So we try to finance useful stuff, and it's impossible. And that, of course, has to do with government policies, with externalities, with regulation, and all that kind of stuff, which helps to scale up sustainable business. So on all those three levels, a lot of things have to change. And that's not a reason not to do anything, because you can always do a lot. But it would really help if this would also change.
Do you want to follow up on that, or no? Okay. Yeah, just I think zooming out of the financial lens a little bit. Maybe Rob, you could give us a concrete example where you saw imagination translated into real-world economic change.
Yeah, I would say the example that I love from the transition movement, and I talk about it a lot. If you've seen me speaking before, you've probably heard it. But in Liège, in Belgium, in 2014, the transition group in Liège, they came up with a really good what-if question. They said, what if, in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? They called it the Liège Food Belt. And they did a big event. They invited everybody in Liège who cared about food. 600 people came to this big open space event that they did. 4 years later, I went back to Liège, and in that time they had raised 5 million euros of investment into 30 new cooperatives, not from the banks, not from the municipality, from the people of Liège investing into those cooperatives. It was phenomenal. Then if you go there now, the municipality, who spent the first 3 years thinking these people are mad and this is never going to work, have got really behind it and invested millions of euros in a food logistics hub on the edge of town. They now produce thousands of school meals every day. The model has spread to 6 other cities in Belgium. My prediction is that by 2030, in Lewis's story of the future, the idea of every city building a food belt will just become the new normal. Why would you not build a food belt when it does achieve so much more than not building a food belt? So for me, when I look at that, it started with a group of people who had an idea, 4 or 5 of them sitting around a table. Should we do this? Okay. It might not have worked, but it did work, and there is incredible power in that moment of going, should we give it a go? Yeah, let's give it a go. And actually, when you go there now, every time I go, it blows me away, and it's been nice. A few people, academics and people in the UK have said to me, where's a good example? And I say, oh, you should go to Liège. I'm always a bit worried they might come back and go, well, I went to Liège, but I was a bit underwhelmed, Rob, really. And they always come back and go, oh my God, it was so much better than you said. So I really recommend, the thing is that 2030, that 2040, that 2050 did not fall magically out of the sky on New Year's Eve 2050. If you knew where to look in 2025, you could already see it. You could get, and I think one of the things in response to the question before was that we need to think much more joined up. We need to stop looking at something like Liège as just being a food strategy. That is also could be seen as a citywide mental health strategy, a public health strategy. The Dutch government invests €500 million in building state-of-the-art, incredible cycling infrastructure because they know that it saves them €19 billion a year off the national health bill. It's not an expense, it's an investment in well-being. And doing all of the things we need to do to get to the world that Lewis painted so beautifully, each of those steps is an improvement. But we need to think more holistically and joined up so we don't just see these as standalone projects.
And thinking of these projects and initiatives you just mentioned, what's something you would like to ask Hans or Triodos Bank to launch as a financial instrument or initiative? What's something you need for this transformation finance-wise?
I would say firstly, I think Triodos Bank is awesome, and in terms of the banks and institutions that get this, Triodos is the best thing that we have. But I would say that actually, from my experience of being involved in big, really ambitious community projects, often the way it works is that the community carries all the risk up to the point where it has a completely investable, completely safe, tied up little beautiful bundle of an investment possibility. I would love to see some of the sharing of some of the risk to get to that point, because there's lots of projects that actually would get there quicker with the expertise, the earlier investment. It's something that you see in Silicon Valley. They come in earlier, and I think when there's really ambitious community projects to come in a bit earlier and share some of the risk would be amazing.
Yeah, I'm
not putting you on the spot already.
No. This is what I try to say also. When you work from within the financial system, you cannot, if you have the savings money of your customers, there is a limit to the risk you can take from that. So this is simply the banking side. So you need to have different instruments. That's what we try to do, with different instruments that can take more risk. But what you don't want to have, why is all that money in Silicon Valley? That money in Silicon Valley is not to do nice sustainable products, that's to earn a lot of money. So this is the same profit incentive that we have again and again. So to find that money, that patient capital that wants to do exactly what we also want to do. So these kind of community projects, we are doing quite a lot of that kind of stuff. And of course we want to do more, but if you are in the financial system, and even we require a lower return, so we can do a little bit more. But still, we are a commercial bank working from within the system, so there's a limit to it. And that will always be the case. And that's also why I said before, if we don't change the rules of the system, the financial system will never support that economy that Lewis showed. So we need to have fundamental changes in that system to get there. And that to come back to your question, so what we do is try to get guarantees from the European Investment Foundation, as all kinds of ways to share risk and to do more to support that sustainable economy. Community initiatives are very important, social housing, cooperatives, all that kind of stuff, that's what we want to do. But there is a limit to what is possible.
Yeah. I think we could sit here another hour and talk about this topic. Unfortunately, our time is up. I would like to ask you both one last question. Louis ended his keynote on a call to action to our audience. What's something, in maybe 3 sentences, one action or step you'd like to see more people take or take this audience away today?
Yeah, I have a very short one. Know where your money goes. If you are thinking deeply about sustainability and you care, think about where your savings are and what bank and what that bank is doing. Just look at it and try to understand where your money goes. That's a very impactful action everybody can take.
I read a beautiful report recently by an organization called UN Global Pulse, who are within the UN trying to promote it becoming a much more imaginative, expansive organization. And one of the tools that they suggest, which I loved, was what they called a multidisciplinary residency, which was to say, if you want your organization to expand its imagination, bring in artists, economists, chefs, painters, dancers, you know, expand who's there and create. The imagination needs space. If your organization doesn't create space for reimagining, it will just carry on doing what it always did, because that's what it's set up to do. So intentionally make space and bring in a really eclectic diversity of voices to support you in that process.
Thank you both so much. I think that was a very interesting panel. So, we've heard now how imagination and finance can shape a new economic story. But how do we ensure that this story is inclusive, centering those who have been historically excluded from the table? To take us deeper into the perspective of youth leadership and climate justice from the Global South perspective, I'm thrilled to welcome our next speaker, climate justice activist and co-founder of the Re-Earth initiative, Xiye Bastida. Welcome, Xiye. It's awesome to have you here. You're one of the most powerful voices, reminding us that the climate crisis is deeply intertwined with historical injustices. Having an indigenous and global South point of view in this topic, how do you see the root causes of the crisis differently from the mainstream narrative?
Thank you so much, and hi everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for just opening up your minds and your brains and your energy for imagination. I am very pleased to hear the former panelists, because often when, as a young person, I talk about imagination, I often get the feeling that people think we're being unrealistic or there's this naivety tied to it. So I choose to come and say that imagining vivid futures that are positive is really hard, and it actually makes us a bit uncomfortable because of how hard it is. So thank you. And just to answer your question about systems and the roots of the climate crisis, I think we are all on the same page that carbon emissions are the main root of the climate crisis, but that's kind of what we have allowed the scope to be. Sometimes we go and say fossil fuels and coal, oil, gas, and we are fighting in the United Nations to get this language inside of the texts. As many of you might know, the Paris Agreement didn't even include oil, gas, and coal in the decision text. So at the official levels, there is no consensus on even where the crisis is. And we know that that's just the surface, because the true roots of the climate crisis are colonialism, the idea of going to a different place and taking over and extracting and saying that land is mine and I don't care about the people who live there. Now it's reflected in neoliberalism, and we can talk about all the isms that there are and how these are the real roots of injustice and what we see today. But I want to illustrate to you what it really looks like on the ground, because it's really easy to say these things and not know what they look like. About 2 months ago, I was in Ecuador, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and I went to see the gold mining in Ecuador. If you're familiar with gold mining in Ecuador, there is actually a lot of legal gold mining. What it means is the government gives a huge concession, and they say it's legal for companies to mine here. But actually, each site is illegal because it's cheaper for them to not get the permits, to not do the environmental assessments, to not talk to the communities, to not pay the communities well. So they have like a bubble of protection of legality, but on the ground itself, it's all illegal. Gold mining in Ecuador produces in the Napa region anywhere from $1.5 million to the later estimates of $8 million every day. And each gold mining worker is paid around $30 to $40 a day. So we see that these resources are not staying in the community. They're damaging ecosystems, they're polluting the rivers, and most importantly, the companies that own these operations are definitely not local. They're in Canada, they're in China, they're in other places across the world. What broke my heart was not knowing all these facts, was being in the Napo River and seeing kids bathing in that water. It's seeing the kids who are joyous, who are having fun, who are jumping in and out of the water, and they don't know that their patrimonies are, is that a word in English? Patrimonial? That's what breaks my heart, that they don't know what it was, what it once was, what they have the right to live, to experience, and that explaining neoliberalism to a kid is not going to make sense to them, but what makes sense is what makes me happy, what is my culture, what do I have a right to. So, and I think illustrating it is one of the most powerful things we can do, because if not, we're just talking to people who know our same language. And one of the main things that we do in activism is be translators of what happens in the negotiations to the ground and vice versa. So we have to get really good at telling vivid stories, not just because we pay more attention to them as humans, but because we are then addressing an issue of just understanding and accessibility. So I hope more of these stories are highlighted so that we really see what the roots of the climate crisis are causing today, which is a new type of colonialism.
You already mentioned narratives now, and when you talk in your youth movements, you don't just advocate for change, but you say you embody it. So what do you think the world can learn from the ways young activists are building these alternatives and alternative narratives?
At the beginning of the youth movement, when I joined about 5 years ago, we had this really big narrative around adults stealing our future and companies selling out our future. And even though a lot of those things might be true, we realized that that didn't make people want to join the movement, because we were against a lot of things. We were not for things. So now we have a really clear agreement that we will criticize the things that are wrong, but we will ask people to do things for the positive. Will you join us in making the city greener? Will you join us in making the city more walkable? Will you join us in protecting the Amazon rainforest? And when you frame things positively, I think just people want to be part of it, out for the right reasons, not just for the immediate rage and fear that you might get from learning about the climate crisis. So that's been one of the main tactics. Another one has been that I joined Fridays for Future when I was living in New York, and all of the other Fridays for Future activists were in Europe, and they were mobilizing tens of thousands of kids. But all my friends in Mexico didn't feel welcomed into those strikes. My friends from Malaysia said, I cannot strike because striking is illegal for me. So half of the world, if not more, because 87% of people under 30 live in the global south. So let's say about almost 90% of global youth felt that the climate movement didn't reflect them, or that they didn't feel like they could be part of it. So I set out to start an organization called Re-Earth Initiative that has its main values on accessibility and inclusivity for youth in the global south. Because these spaces of activism were not built for us, and we couldn't have the impact that we wanted to have because we were scared of joining the same types of activism. So now we translate everything to 5 languages. We have distributed about $290,000 in grants for youth in the global south, and we're permanently broke. We don't have money because we just keep giving it away. Because one of the main things that we embody is this sentiment that we're not regranting, we're redistributing any wealth that we have to others. And that is a new way of living in the world that we have not been necessarily taught. We don't know if that's the right thing to do. We don't know if it's sustainable, and probably it isn't. But what I know is that my activism kicked off because somebody believed in me, and the next person did, and the next person did. And I want to be part of that trail of believing in each other for the youth climate movement in the global south. So even if they get 1 grant from us because we don't get funding the next year, it doesn't matter, because they believe they got somebody who believed in them. That is what I'm holding on to, the fact that we just need to believe in each other. I am where I am because my mom told me, you can do anything you want with your life. And I said, you know what? Yeah, I can. So that we need to say that to each other. And we are really embodying this sentiment that if you win, I win. And if I have an opportunity that I got this year, you can get it next year. And that is not how the environmental movement has behaved, because they're fighting for dollars and etc. We want to disrupt that. And I think that's what makes us different, makes us special, and should make us really participate in every room to reimagine how we're presenting the climate movement to be. And the last thing I'll say about this, because the first session really got me thinking, was that imagination and ideas really come out of boredom. You get the best ideas and the best, greatest illustrative imagination when you are bored. And if you were a kid playing with dolls and your shoes were cars, that is where, the type of boredom I'm talking about, where it just pushes you to think a bit farther. And in the attention economy that we have today, where every second that we are bored, we just look at our phones and scroll, and our attention spans are declining rapidly, and you see little kids with iPads everywhere. What we're taking away is actually little kids' ability to imagine. And we are the ones who have lived both worlds. A lot of technology, not a lot of technology. So we need to protect that. I think imagination should be a human right. I don't know how that actually works, but that is the type of ideas that we need to start having, because we're not going to get out of this crisis by feeding our brains endless trails of information that will leave us exhausted at the end of the day. To complement what was said earlier about the power of imagination, when we imagine vivid futures, we use 11 parts of our brain. And when we imagine past scenarios, we use 6 parts of our brain. So we're activating 5 more parts of our brains when we think about what the world looks like vividly in 10 years from now. And that is the type of insight that we need to be tapping into, and that we need to embrace and give ourselves the homework, because it is hard to imagine vividly what the world looks like out of your window 10 years from now. Where are you waking up? Who are you waking up with? What does outside smell like? Like, those questions that were asked, we need to answer them.
When you imagine a kind of post-growth world, how do you think we can avoid reproducing the same patterns of inequality we're trying to dismantle at the time?
I think electric cars are the golden child for this explanation, because they're still based on this framework that is extracting a lot of resources, and they're communicated to us to be the climate solution. So they are really greenwashing, a greenwashing package. And I remember when I understood this, I felt lied to, and I felt that we weren't really getting to the root of a lot of our issues. And with mobility is investing in public transportation. So when I think about these new models, these economic models, obviously a lot of us start to talk about things like debt for nature, and we start to talk about things like debt for climate, and a lot of the issues are the insane amount of debt that the Global South has, because they borrowed money from the World Bank 10 years ago, and it's still messing up the country's economies. But when I think about it from a place that I know, because I'm not an economist, that makes sense to me, I realize that the answer is actually a lot of the ways in which, the insights of the ways in which I was raised. I was raised in an indigenous community in central Mexico called the Otomi Toltec indigenous community. And we have values of good living, buen vivir, of Pachamama. We don't ask ourselves, how do we make our lives and the world better, and how can we get better and better? We ask ourselves, what is good? Because when you're asking what is better, you will always be unsatisfied. But if you tap into asking what is good, you can achieve that. And there will be ups and downs, but you know what a steady line is. And that's what needs to happen with our ecosystems, with our economic models, with our communities. And I imagine a world where we don't talk about saving nature in a way that is only through commodification, through giving value to ecosystems in a way that makes money, but that we can really go beyond that and see the value of a thriving forest because it is. And I think we can get there.
You briefly touched upon debt for climate in your answer. Could you briefly elaborate on what that is and why do you see that as a part of climate justice?
Debt for Climate is an organization. It's also a way of thinking about how we can swap protecting different ecosystems for debt. So, for example, Colombia could get their debt canceled if they protected X amount of rainforest. And this idea has been going around for quite a while when we're talking about carbon markets and nature. And because now the main conversation in the United Nations is all about the NCQG, which makes no sense to anybody unless you're in the negotiation tracks. It basically means how do we fund climate adaptation, mitigation, and the energy transition. But all of these things that governments are talking about is still loans, which are going to put countries into more debt. So if climate solutions keep costing more and more debt, then they're going to be perpetuating same economic injustices that we see from the World Bank today. So debt for climate is like a transition solution so that we can get to a new economic system that truly puts life and nature at the center. They're really cool. You should check them out. And they are advocating for the cancellation of all of the Global South's debt, which you cannot arrive to a middle ground of a solution if you don't advocate for the, all the way. So that's also another tactic that we employ. Yeah.
I think we could probably sit here for hours and talk about this topic. I have probably another 25 backup questions I would like to ask you. Unfortunately, we're out of time in a minute. If you could ask everyone in this room to take a step towards a more regenerative and inclusive future, what would it be?
Every time I'm asked this question, I wish I had the perfect answer. And the truth is that we might never have the perfect answer for the one thing that you can do. But what occurred to me today was that I would like all of you to make a pledge that lasts 1 year, whatever that is. No new clothes for a year, no airplanes for a year, plant-based diet for a year, whatever it is. Think about what your year pledge can be and share that with your friends and invite them to make a pledge. Even if it's watch a video of a climate activist every week for 1 year, you can get very creative. But I think the most important part of this is you tell your friends about it and you invite them to do it. That's the only way in which we're truly going to get systemic change, especially today where our attentions are always being grabbed by the next thing. So build community around the decisions and the pledges that you take. Thank you.
That was a great call to action.